I want to tell you something that Philip Rowe said to me on a Tuesday morning in March. He looked across a glass conference table, straightened the collar of a suit that probably cost more than my first car, and said, with a completely straight face, "Honestly, Marcus, most of what your team does can be automated now." I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. I had been at that company for 14 years. 14 years of early mornings and late nights. 14 years of phone calls I took on weekends because something needed to get done. 14 years of building systems from nothing, holding relationships together with my bare hands, and keeping that company standing in moments when it should have fallen. And this man, who had been there for 18 months, just told me my work could be automated. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe to join our community. I share real workplace stories every day for anyone who believes quiet competence should always be respected. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 47 years old. At the time of that meeting, I was the director of operations at a company called Trident Systems. We were a mid-sized logistics technology firm. We helped large freight and distribution companies manage their vendor networks, stay compliant with federal regulations, and keep their supply chains running clean. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't the kind of work people make movies about. But it was real, it was complicated, and it mattered enormously to the clients who depended on it. I had spent 14 years becoming one of the most important people inside that building. Not the most visible, not the loudest in meetings, but one of the most important. That Tuesday morning, I didn't know I was walking into a termination meeting. I had been told it was a quarterly operations review. I showed up with my laptop and a folder of notes. I sat down across from Derek Carlson, the CEO, and Philip Rowe, the CFO. Derek was 52. He had come in from a private equity background 4 years earlier when the original founder, Gerald Ferris, retired. Philip was 34. He had an MBA from school he mentioned in almost every meeting. He had been with the company for about a year and a half. Derek spoke first. He said the company was streamlining for growth. He said it the way people say things when they've rehearsed them. Carefully, flatly, like reading from card. Then Philip slid a single sheet of paper across the table. I looked at it. It was a departmental restructuring notice. My department, a 6-person operations and systems compliance team, was being dissolved entirely. The document said the decision was driven by a targeted cost reduction of $400,000 annually. My team, gone. I had 30 days. There was no severance discussion, no acknowledgement of what my team had built, no offer to reassign me somewhere else in the company at any level. Just 30 days, a restructuring notice, and Philip Rowe explaining that the remaining responsibilities would be distributed across existing personnel and supported by automation tools. I looked at Derek while Philip was talking. Derek was looking at the table, not at me, at the table. I had known Derek for 4 years. I had sat in his office. I had sent him reports. I had once stayed until midnight helping his team prepare for a board presentation because he asked me to personally. He couldn't look at me. I kept my face still. I'm not the kind of man who raises his voice in a meeting. I never have been. I've always believed that the worst thing you can do when someone is underestimating you is prove them right by losing control. So I sat there and I listened and I processed what was happening with a kind of cold, quiet clarity that surprised even me. When Philip finished talking, he asked if I had any questions. I said no. I picked up my laptop and my folder. I stood up. I shook Derek's hand. He finally looked at me then, briefly, and I walked out of that conference room. In the hallway, I stopped for just a second. The building was quiet. The lights were on. People were working at their desks like any other Tuesday morning. None of them knew what had just happened. None of them knew what was coming. I thought about what Philip had said. Most of what your team does can be automated now. I walked to my office and closed the door behind me. He had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to them. Let me tell you how I got there. Because the ending of a story only makes sense if you understand the beginning. I joined Trident Systems in 2010. Back then, it wasn't the company it would become. It was a small regional firm, maybe 80 employees, running on outdated software, a patchwork of vendor agreements that nobody had reviewed properly in years, and a client base that was quietly growing frustrated. 2 of their largest accounts had already started shopping around. The compliance infrastructure was almost non-existent. The operations side was being managed through a combination of spreadsheets, tribal knowledge, and a lot of hoping nothing went wrong. I was brought in as a senior operations analyst. My job title was modest. My actual job was to figure out why things kept breaking and fix them before the whole structure collapsed. Within the first year, I had mapped every active vendor contract and identified 11 agreements that were either expired, incorrectly classified, or missing key documentation. I flagged them. I rebuilt the filing system. I created a review calendar so nothing would slip through again. Within 3 years, I had redesigned the entire vendor coordination process, built the company's first regulatory compliance framework from scratch, and personally saved 2 major client contracts that had been days away from termination. One of those clients told Gerald Ferris directly that the only reason they were renewing was because of the work my team had done. Gerald Ferris was the kind of leader you don't forget. He had started the company himself, built it slowly, and cared about the people in it the way a man cares about something he made with his own hands. He walked the floor every Friday morning. He knew people's names, not just the managers, everyone. He asked about your family. He remembered what you told him. When something went right, he said thank you and meant it. Those were good years. Gerald retired in 2019. I understood it. He had earned it. But when Derek Carlson walked in the door 3 months later, something shifted in the air of that building, and it never quite shifted back. Derek came from private equity. He spoke in terms of efficiency ratios and growth vectors and optimizing human capital. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't a bad person. But he looked at the company the way an investor looks at a portfolio, as a collection of assets to be arranged for maximum return. The people inside it were line items. Philip Rowe arrived 18 months after Derek. Young, polished, confident in a way that had nothing to do with experience. He brought in new dashboards, new reporting structures, new vocabulary. Meetings that used to take 30 minutes started taking 90. Decisions that used to be made by people who understood the work started being made by people who understood the presentation of the work. I watched it happen. I kept my head down. I kept doing what I had always done. My team by that point was 6 people. Carla Nunez, who had been with me for 9 years and knew our compliance systems better than anyone alive. 2 analysts, a documentation specialist, and 2 coordinators who managed the client-facing side of our operations. Together, we held the operational nervous system of that company in our hands every single day. We managed the vendor compliance documentation for 23 active contracts. We ran the regulatory audit preparation for 3 federal logistics certifications. We maintained the architecture of the client portal. We produced the risk reports that 2 of Trident's largest clients required under their service agreements. None of them saw us. Not really. They saw the dashboard numbers. They saw the reports. They didn't see the 6 people who made those numbers real. That was the invisible foundation I had spent 14 years building. And one Tuesday morning in March, they decided they didn't need it anymore. There's a difference between knowing how a machine works and knowing why it works. Anyone can read a manual. Anyone can follow a checklist. But the kind of knowledge I'm talking about, the kind my team carried, wasn't written down anywhere. It lived in our heads. It lived in the relationships we had built over years. It lived in the quiet understanding of why certain things were done a certain way and what happened the last time someone tried to do them differently. Let me explain exactly what my team managed. Not in corporate language. In plain terms. First, we handled vendor compliance documentation for 23 active contracts. That meant making sure every vendor Trident worked with met the regulatory and operational standards required by both federal guidelines and individual client agreements. This wasn't just filing paperwork. It meant knowing each vendor personally, knowing their renewal cycles, knowing which ones had a history of documentation gaps, knowing which federal classifications applied to which categories of freight. Our contacts at those vendors knew us by name. They called us directly when something changed. That relationship took years to build. Second, we managed the audit preparation for 3 federal logistics certifications that Trident held. These certifications were not decorative. They were operational requirements. Without them, Trident could not legally service certain categories of freight contracts. The preparation process for each certification renewal was months long. It required coordinating between internal teams, external vendors, and federal compliance officers who had their own timelines, their own preferred formats, and their own unwritten expectations. I had built those relationships. Personally, those compliance officers knew my name. They trusted my documentation because I had never given them a reason not to. Third, we maintained the architecture of Trident's primary client portal, the system that clients use to track their shipments, review their compliance status, and access their billing records. I hadn't built the software itself, but my team had built the workflow logic inside it. The classification rules, the routing structure, the exception flags. We were the ones who knew why certain fields were configured the way they were, and what would break if someone changed them without understanding the logic underneath. Fourth, we produced rolling operational risk reports for two of Trident's largest clients, Caldwell Logistics and Norpac Supply. These reports were not optional. They were written into those client service agreements. Trident was contractually obligated to deliver them on a specific schedule. My team had always produced them. That obligation didn't disappear when my team did. Now here is the thing about institutional knowledge. It's invisible until it's gone. While my team was there, everything ran. Certifications renewed on time. Vendors stayed compliant. The portal worked. The reports went out. Nobody upstairs thought about any of it because they never had to. To Derek and Philip, all of that was just background noise. It was the thing that was already done, always done, reliably done, and therefore not worth paying attention to. I knew what was coming the moment Philip said the word automate. I had seen it happen before. Not at Trident, at a competitor. A logistics firm on the other side of the state had tried to replace their compliance team with a combination of software tools and a single junior coordinator. It took them 18 months and 2 federal regulatory fines before they got back to baseline. 18 months of chaos, client complaints, paused contracts, and emergency consulting fees, all to rebuild something that had been working perfectly before they dismantled it. I thought about that company the day I walked out of that conference room. And I thought about something else, something that mattered more than the certifications, more than the vendor contracts, more than the portal architecture. Brian Caldwell at Caldwell Logistics had asked for me by name at their last contract renewal. He had said directly to Derek that the relationship with my team was one of the reasons they stayed with Trident. Norpac Supply's operations VP had said something similar 18 months earlier. They trusted Trident because they trusted us. That trust wasn't in any document Philip Rowe had ever read. They asked me to write a transition document. That was the official request, a knowledge transfer guide that would allow the remaining staff to absorb my team's responsibilities after we were gone. Philip sent me an email outlining what he wanted, a summary of active processes, key contacts, system access notes, and a timeline for handing off each area of responsibility. I read that email twice. Then I opened a blank document and I started writing. I spent 2 weeks on it. I was thorough. I was professional. I documented everything that was visible, every named process, every scheduled task, every system login, every vendor contact with a phone number and email address. I wrote it clearly enough that someone with basic operational knowledge could read it and understand what each function was supposed to do. But somewhere in the middle of that second week, I made a decision. I would document what was visible. I would not volunteer what was invisible. I wasn't going to sabotage anything. I want to be clear about that. I didn't delete files. I didn't corrupt systems. I didn't poison the vendor relationships or tell clients anything they shouldn't know. That's not who I am. I had spent 14 years doing things the right way, and I wasn't going to change that in my final 30 days. But I also wasn't going to go beyond what they asked me to do. They had looked at my team's work and decided it was redundant overhead. They had looked at 14 years of careful, invisible labor and seen a line on a spreadsheet that was too expensive. Fine. Then they could have exactly what they paid for, a transition document that answered the questions they knew to ask. I had worked long enough to know one thing clearly. Institutions don't reward loyalty. They absorb it. They depend on it. They build their comfort on top of it. And when it becomes inconvenient, they eliminate it and call it efficiency. It was no longer my job to protect people who had looked me in the eye and called my life's work redundant overhead. So I wrote the document. I handed it in, and I said nothing more. Those 30 days were heavy in ways that had nothing to do with the office. My youngest daughter, Ava, was starting college in September. She had been accepted to a program she had worked toward for 3 years. We had planned for it. We had saved for it. But the plan had always assumed a stable income, and a stable income had just been removed with 30 days' notice and no severance discussion. My mortgage had 8 years left. My wife, Linda, had gone back to part-time work a few years earlier when I had taken a salary reduction during a difficult year for the company. One of those years where leadership asked people to sacrifice and promised it would be remembered. Linda had never gone back to full-time after that. We had talked about it, but never pushed it. We had been comfortable enough. Until now, comfortable enough had been sufficient. I didn't tell Linda the full weight of what I was carrying those first few days. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed a few days to carry it myself before I could hand any of it to someone else. She knew something was wrong. She always knows. But she let me have those days, and I loved her for it. My last day at Trident was a Thursday in early April. I cleaned out my desk quietly. I shook hands with the people who came by. Carla hugged me and didn't say much, which told me she felt exactly what I felt. A few of the other team members looked like they were trying not to show that they were angry on my behalf. I passed Philip Rowe in the hallway near the elevator. He gave me a nod. Not a word. Just a nod like I was someone he vaguely recognized from a conference. That evening, Derek sent me an email. Not a phone call. Not a handshake at the door. An email. It said, "Marcus, thank you for your contributions to Trident over the years. We wish you well." I printed it out when I got home. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I already knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, that I would want that record one day. I folded it and put it in the drawer of my desk at home. Then I went and sat with Linda in the kitchen, and we talked for a long time about what came next. The first 3 weeks after Trident were quieter than I expected. I spent the time the way you spend time when the structure of your days has suddenly been removed. Slowly, carefully, try to figure out what the new shape of things was going to be. I updated my resume. I reached out to a few people in my network. I took some long walks in the morning that I told myself were for my health, but were really just a way of having somewhere to go. Linda was steady. She always is. She picked up an extra shift at work without making a point of it, and when I thanked her for it, she just said, "We're fine, Marcus. Give a minute." I was giving a minute. Then, on a Wednesday morning about 3 weeks after my last day, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number immediately. I picked up. It was Brian Caldwell. Brian was the director of operations at Caldwell Logistics, one of Trident's largest regional clients. I had worked with Brian for close to 6 years. We weren't friends exactly. We were something more specific than that. We were two operations people who understood each other's language and had built a working relationship on the foundation of never wasting each other's time. He respected my work. I respected his. When Brian called, it was always about something real. He didn't open with small talk that morning. He told me that Trident had recently sent Caldwell's team a compliance renewal packet, the quarterly vendor classification documentation that my team had always prepared and submitted. The packet had been put together by Seth, a young internal coordinator who had been handed a portion of my team's former responsibilities as part of the restructuring. There were 3 errors in it. Not small errors. Not formatting issues. 3 substantive errors in the vendor classification fields, the kind of errors that, under DOT logistics regulations, could trigger an automatic audit flag. If Caldwell's own compliance officer hadn't caught them before submission, Brian's company could have been looking at a federal review that had nothing to do with anything they had actually done wrong. Brian wasn't just frustrated. He was rattled. And Brian Caldwell did not rattle easily. He said, "I need to know what's going on over there, Marcus." I was quiet for a moment. Then I told him the truth. I told him I no longer worked at Trident, that my department had been eliminated in a restructuring in March, that I had been gone for about 3 weeks. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Brian said, "They eliminated your whole team?" I said yes. Another pause. Then, carefully, he said, "Well, what are you doing now?" I told him I was in transition, looking at options. Nothing locked in yet. He said, "Okay." And then, almost like he was thinking out loud rather than talking to me, "Okay, let me make some calls." We wrapped up the conversation shortly after that. He thanked me for being straight with him. I told him I was sorry I couldn't give him better news about Trident. I meant that. Whatever had happened between me and that company, it wasn't Brian's problem, and I had never been the kind of man who lets his personal situation become someone else's burden. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't the beginning of some plan forming in my head. It was something closer to a heavy, tired confirmation of something I had already known. The problems had started. It had only been 3 weeks, and the problems had already started. I thought about Seth, a young man who had been handed something he didn't know how to hold, and I didn't feel angry at him. I felt something closer to sorry. Then I went and made a cup of coffee and started thinking about what came next. I didn't have a spy inside Trident. I want to make that clear. What I had was Carla. Carla Nunez had been on my team for 9 years. When the department was dissolved, she had been absorbed into a general operations support role, essentially reassigned to do a version of what she had always done, but without the structure, the authority, or the resources that had made the work manageable. She was good at her job in the way that quiet, experienced people are good at their jobs. Not loudly, not visibly, but completely and reliably. She texted me occasionally after I left. Not gossip. Carla wasn't a gossip. She sent me the kind of messages that operations people send each other. Short, factual, understated. Things like, certification calendar wasn't transferred correctly. Seth doesn't know the renewal dates. Or, portal flagging errors again. Nobody knows why. I read each one carefully. I didn't share them with anyone. I didn't do anything with them. But I kept them, and I understood what they meant. By June, the first serious problem had surfaced. One of the 3 federal logistics certifications my team had always managed, a DOT carrier compliance certification that Trident needed to legally service certain categories of freight contracts, came up for renewal. Under my team's management, renewal preparation began 90 days in advance. Contacts were made, documentation was gathered, filing schedules were confirmed with the relevant federal office. Seth missed the renewal window, not by a day, by enough that the certification lapsed for 11 days before anyone in the building realized what had happened. During those 11 days, 2 active shipment contracts had to be quietly paused. Clients were told there was a system update causing processing delays. That was the explanation that went out. A system update. I found out through Carla. She sent me 2 words, cert lapsed. I sat with that for a moment. Then I put my phone down and went back to what I was doing. I had mentioned the certification renewal calendar in the transition document. I had listed the dates. I had noted the lead time required. It was all there in plain language. But listing a date is not the same as understanding why that date matters, what happens if you miss it, who to call when you're 60 days out, and how to handle the federal office when they have questions about your documentation history. That knowledge hadn't been in the transition document, because nobody had asked for it. By August, the client portal had developed a billing error that was producing duplicate charge entries for Norpac Supply. Norpac's finance team flagged it almost immediately. They were a sharp operation, and their accounts payable team reviewed everything closely. The error wasn't catastrophic on its own, but it was the kind of error that, when it appears in a client-facing system, makes clients ask questions. And the questions Norpac started asking were not comfortable ones. Trident's response was slow. The internal team that had inherited the portal maintenance didn't fully understand the workflow logic my team had built into it. They could see that something was wrong. They couldn't easily see why. A ticket was opened. The ticket sat. Norpac's account manager started making calls. Carla texted me in August. Norpac is not happy. Philip had a call with him last week. Don't know what was said. By September, Philip Rowe had made a decision that told me everything I needed to know about how badly things had deteriorated inside that building. He hired an outside operations consulting firm, an outside firm, to do what my team had done, to come in, assess the damage, rebuild the processes, and stabilize the client relationships that were starting to wobble. The consulting firm's initial project estimate was $310,000. That was just for the assessment phase, not the repair, not the implementation, just the assessment. I remember reading that number when Carla passed it along and feeling something that I can only describe as a surgeon's recognition. When you spend enough time inside a system, you develop a clinical understanding of how it fails. You know the sequence. You know the stages. You know what each symptom means and what comes next. I had told Derek in one of our last real conversations before the restructuring was finalized that the operational risk of eliminating my team was significant. I hadn't made it dramatic. I just said it plainly the way I said most things. He had thanked me for my input. Nobody had listened. And now they were paying $310,000 to have a stranger come in and listen to the building make the sounds I had already described. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. I felt the way you feel when you watch something break that you try to protect. October arrived like a verdict. I had been out of Trident for 6 months by then. I had taken on 2 small consulting engagements, both referrals from former colleagues who had heard I was available and knew what I was capable of. The work was modest. It kept me sharp and brought in some income. But I hadn't found the right full-time opportunity yet, and the weight of that was still present every morning when I woke up. Then the calls started coming. The first one that mattered was from Brian Caldwell. We had spoken a few times since that initial call in April. Nothing formal, just 2 operations, people staying in contact the way people in this industry do. But this call was different. Brian told me that Caldwell Logistics had made a formal decision to reduce their service contract with Trident by 40%. 40%. He didn't say it with any satisfaction. Brian wasn't that kind of man. He said it the way someone says something they wish they didn't have to say. He told me the decision had been documented internally as driven by service consistency concerns. That was the official language. What it meant, in plain terms, was that Trident had fumbled enough handoffs, missed enough details, and responded slowly enough to enough problems that Caldwell's leadership no longer felt comfortable depending on them at full contract value. They weren't leaving entirely, but a 40% reduction on a contract the size of Caldwell's was not a small number. It was a loud signal. I thanked Brian for telling me. He said, "I just thought you should know." I understood what he meant by that. The second call came indirectly. Brian mentioned, toward the end of our conversation, that he had heard through the freight industry network that Norpac Supply had requested an emergency service review meeting with Trident. That was significant. Norpac didn't use the word emergency lightly. Their operations VP, a sharp and direct woman named Carol Voss, was not known for patience when she felt a vendor relationship was deteriorating. Trident sent Philip Rowe to that meeting. I learned afterward, through Carla, what had happened in that room. Carol Voss had opened the meeting by asking one question before any agenda item was addressed. She had asked whether Marcus Hale was still with the company. Philip told her no. Carol Voss ended the meeting 20 minutes later and told Philip that Norpac would be evaluating their options. Within 2 weeks, Norpac Supply issued a formal contract termination notice. That contract was worth $2.3 million annually. I sat with that number for a long time when I heard it. $2.3 million a year, gone because a VP walked into a meeting, asked one question, and didn't like the answer. That wasn't revenge. That was consequence. There is a difference, and it matters. Around the same time, word had spread, the way word always spreads in a regional industry where everyone knows everyone, that I was available. I hadn't advertised myself. I hadn't campaigned. But 2 of the consulting referrals had led to conversations, and those conversations had led to more conversations. And by October, I had been approached by a mid-sized logistics firm called Halcourt Distribution about a full-time director of operations role. Halcourt was a serious company. They had done their homework. When I met with their leadership team, they already knew my background in detail. They asked good questions. They understood what the work actually involved. They offered me the role at a salary 22% higher than what Trident had paid me. I told them I needed a few days to think. They said take your time. Meanwhile, the outside consulting firm Trident had hired had now billed them $640,000. The work was still ongoing. The federal certification that had lapsed in June had triggered a secondary compliance review that was now requiring legal representation. Attorney fees had entered the picture. I did the math one evening at my kitchen table. I didn't do it out of bitterness. I did it because numbers are how I think, and The numbers were telling a story that deserved to be told clearly. Lost contract revenue from NORPAC, $2.3 million annually, with immediate effect. Reduced revenue from the Caldwell contract reduction, significant and documented. The outside consulting firm, $640,000 billed, with more to come. The secondary compliance review and legal fees still accumulating. Operational disruption, pause contracts, internal productivity losses, real costs that don't always appear on a single line, but add up across every department they touch. By the time I added it together, the number was approaching $6 million. They had cut my department to save $400,000 a year. What that decision had cost them by December was approaching 15 times that amount. I closed my notebook. I turned off the kitchen light. Then I called Hallcourt Distribution and told them I would take the job. I started at Hallcourt Distribution on the second Monday of November. My new office was smaller than my old one at Trident. The building was less polished. The coffee in the break room was not as good. But when I walked in on that first morning and met with the leadership team, something was different in the air, something I hadn't felt inside a company building in a long time. They looked at me when they talked to me. The CEO, a man named Robert Hallcourt, who had built the company himself over 20 years, shook my hand at the door and said, "We've heard a lot about you, Marcus. We know what you built over at Trident. We're glad you're here." That was it. No corporate language. No efficiency ratios. No talk of streamlining for growth. Just, "We know what you built, and we're glad you're here." I won't pretend that didn't mean something to me. In December, Trident's quarterly results were reported internally, and from what I understood through people still connected to that world, the board had begun asking Derek Carlson some very direct questions. About client losses, about the compliance failures, about the cost of the outside consulting firm relative to the cost of the department that had been eliminated to hire them, about what exactly had been gained by the $400,000 cut that had triggered all of it. I was not in that room. I didn't need to be. I was sitting in my new office, working on an operational framework for Hallcourt that I had been designing for 3 weeks, doing the work I had always done for people who understood its value. Linda went back to full-time work in November. Not because we needed her to. The Hallcourt salary had reset our financial footing cleanly. She went back because she wanted to. She had been offered a position she was genuinely excited about, and she took it, and watching her get ready for her first day reminded me that difficult seasons, when they end, can end with more than just relief. They can end with something better than what you had before. Ava finished her first semester of college in December. She called me on a Sunday evening to tell me how her finals had gone. I sat in the kitchen and listened to her talk and felt a quiet gratitude that I don't have the right words for. She didn't know the full weight of what that year had carried. She didn't need to. That was my job, to carry it, so she didn't have to. I've thought a lot about what the real lesson of that year was. It wasn't about Derek Carlson. Derek was a man who had been trained to see companies as financial structures and had never developed the ability to see them as human ones. That's not evil. It's just a particular kind of blindness. It wasn't about Philip Rowe either. Philip was young and confident and had learned to speak the language of business without yet understanding the weight of what that language describes. He'll learn, or he won't. That's not my concern. The real mistake, the one that cost that company $6 million, was simpler and deeper than either of them. They had built a system that measured everything visible and ignored everything invisible. They could measure salary costs. They could measure headcount. They could build a dashboard that showed them exactly how much my team's payroll was costing them every quarter. What they could not measure was the 14 years of knowledge inside those 6 people's heads. The vendor relationships built on trust and consistency. The federal compliance contacts who filed our documentation favorably because they knew our work was clean. The clients who stayed with Trident not because of the company's marketing or its pricing, but because of the people they called when something went wrong. You cannot put that on a dashboard. And when you eliminate it, because you can't see it, reality has a way of making it visible very quickly. If you're watching this and you've spent years doing invisible work, the kind of work that holds things together quietly, the kind that nobody thanks you for because nothing ever breaks, I want you to hear this clearly. The work was real. The knowledge was real. The relationships were real. And real things no matter how invisible they seem in a boardroom on a Tuesday morning in March, have a way of making themselves impossible to ignore.